The operation ended without noise or spectacle. That in itself unsettled everyone. By dawn, the warehouse near the port stood untouched, its steel doors still sealed, the shipment inside missing. No alarms had been triggered, no bodies were found. The men assigned to oversee the transfer returned empty-handed, offering the same explanation in careful, identical words. The route had been clean, the timing precise. And yet, when the locks were cut open under supervision, there was nothing left to recover. The boss arrived after the sun had fully risen. He did not hurry. His car stopped at the edge of the compound and he stepped out slowly, adjusting his coat as if arriving at a routine meeting. Those waiting bowed, but their movements lacked depth. Eyes lifted too quickly. Some did not look at him at all. He walked through the space in silence. Footsteps echoed where there should have been purpose. He studied the empty floor, the scuffed concrete, the faint tire marks that led nowhere useful. No one spoke unless addressed. No one volunteered detail. He listened. He asked short questions. He received careful answers. By the time he left, the conclusion had already formed among them, though no one said it aloud. The next meeting took place that evening in a private dining room overlooking the city. The lights were low. Food was served untouched. Seats that were usually filled remained empty, explained away as conflicts or delays. The men who did attend kept their hands visible on the table, as if reassurance required proof. The boss took his place at the head. He noticed the small changes. A man who once leaned forward now sat back. Another avoided direct alignment, angling his chair just slightly away. Respect was still present, but it had thinned, stretched tight over doubt. Reports were given quietly. Numbers were recited. Losses were acknowledged without emphasis. Each detail was presented as fact, stripped of responsibility. When the meeting ended, the room cleared faster than usual. No one lingered. No one waited for private instruction. Outside, the city moved as it always had. Traffic lights shifted. Pedestrians crossed without looking up. From a distance, nothing had changed. Within the organization, the shift was immediate. Calls that once came early were delayed or rerouted through intermediaries. Decisions that previously required only confirmation were now brought forward with layers of suggestion, framed carefully, as if testing his response. He noticed pauses on the other end of the line, brief silences after he spoke, as though his words were being weighed rather than accepted. He did not confront it. He watched. At headquarters, conversations stopped when he entered a room, then resumed with forced normalcy once he passed. He caught fragments as doors closed, not accusations, not defenses, just uncertainty, allowed to breathe. A younger lieutenant made a minor error during a routine exchange. Nothing costly. Still, the correction was handled publicly, unnecessary in scale. It was framed as concern, but the message carried further than intended. Authority was being redistributed quietly. The boss responded with restraint. He issued no punishments. He canceled no meetings. He continued his schedule with precision, arriving on time, leaving without comment. In the house where he lived, the atmosphere was unchanged on the surface. Staff followed routine. Meals were prepared at the usual hour. The maid moved from room to room with the same measured steps, her presence steady and unremarkable. She had been there for years. Her work left no trace beyond cleanliness. She spoke only when spoken to. When the boss returned late that night, she stood aside as he entered, head lowered, hands folded. He passed without acknowledgement. Upstairs, he sat alone in his study, reviewing documents that no longer reassured him. The betrayal, if it existed, had been efficient, too efficient. It left no clear handprint, only absence. Downstairs, the maid washed the last cup, dried it, and placed it back in its proper position. She turned off the lights in the kitchen one by one, ensuring each switch clicked fully into place. The following days brought no resolution, only accumulation. A partner from a neighboring group postponed a joint venture without explanation. Another requested revised terms on an agreement long settled. Each adjustment was small, defensible on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. The boss attended a public function at a private club, an appearance meant to reassure. He wore a dark suit, perfectly fitted, his expression controlled. Around him, conversations continued, but the tone shifted when he approached. Compliments felt rehearsed. Laughter arrived a second too late. One man, emboldened by proximity to others, offered a remark framed as concern. He spoke about recent instability, about the importance of vigilance. He did not accuse, but he did not need to. The boss listened, nodded once, and moved on. Later, in the restroom, he stood alone at the sink, hands resting on the porcelain, eyes fixed on his reflection. The face staring back showed no anger, only calculation slowed by something unfamiliar. Doubt. At headquarters, an internal audit was announced, proposed by senior members, and approved with visible relief. It was described as routine, necessary, transparent. He allowed it. The audit rooms filled with quiet activity. Files were moved, accounts reviewed. People were questioned politely, then again with greater detail. Each process created distance, reinforcing the idea that the center no longer held absolute clarity. The boss remained present but removed. He attended briefings without interrupting. He asked fewer questions than expected. In the house where he lived, the atmosphere was unchanged on the surface. Staff followed routine. Meals were prepared at the usual hour. The maid moved from room to room with the same measured steps, her presence steady and unremarkable. She had been there for years. Her work left no trace beyond cleanliness. She spoke only when spoken to. When the boss returned late that night, she stood aside as he entered, head lowered, hands folded. He passed without acknowledgement. Upstairs, he sat alone in his study, reviewing documents that no longer reassured him. The betrayal, if it existed, had been efficient, too efficient. It left no clear handprint, only absence. Downstairs, the maid washed the last cup, dried it, and placed it back in its proper position. She turned off the lights in the kitchen one by one, ensuring each switch clicked fully into place. The following days brought no resolution, only accumulation. A partner from a neighboring group postponed a joint venture without explanation. Another requested revised terms on an agreement long settled. Each adjustment was small, defensible on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. The boss attended a public function at a private club, an appearance meant to reassure. He wore a dark suit, perfectly fitted, his expression controlled. Around him, conversations continued, but the tone shifted when he approached. Compliments felt rehearsed. Laughter arrived a second too late. One man, emboldened by proximity to others, offered a remark framed as concern. He spoke about recent instability, about the importance of vigilance. He did not accuse, but he did not need to. The boss listened, nodded once, and moved on. Later, in the restroom, he stood alone at the sink, hands resting on the porcelain, eyes fixed on his reflection. The face staring back showed no anger, only calculation slowed by something unfamiliar. Doubt. At headquarters, an internal audit was announced, proposed by senior members, and approved with visible relief. It was described as routine, necessary, transparent. He allowed it. The audit rooms filled with quiet activity. Files were moved, accounts reviewed. People were questioned politely, then again with greater detail. Each process created distance, reinforcing the idea that the center no longer held absolute clarity. The boss remained present but removed. He attended briefings without interrupting. He asked fewer questions than expected. In the house where he lived, the atmosphere was unchanged on the surface.
Staff followed routine. Meals were prepared at the usual hour. The maid moved from room to room with the same measured steps, her presence steady and unremarkable. She had been there for years. Her work left no trace beyond cleanliness. She spoke only when spoken to. When the boss returned late that night, she stood aside as he entered, head lowered, hands folded. He passed without acknowledgement. Upstairs, he sat alone in his study, reviewing documents that no longer reassured him. The betrayal, if it existed, had been efficient, too efficient. It left no clear handprint, only absence. Downstairs, the maid washed the last cup, dried it, and placed it back in its proper position. She turned off the lights in the kitchen one by one, ensuring each switch clicked fully into place. The following days brought no resolution, only accumulation. A partner from a neighboring group postponed a joint venture without explanation. Another requested revised terms on an agreement long settled. Each adjustment was small, defensible on its own. Together they formed a pattern. The boss attended a public function at a private club, an appearance meant to reassure. He wore a dark suit, perfectly fitted, his expression controlled. Around him, conversations continued, but the tone shifted when he approached. Compliments felt rehearsed, laughter arrived a second too late. One man, emboldened by proximity to others, offered a remark framed as concern. He spoke about recent instability, about the importance of vigilance. He did not accuse, but he did not need to. The boss listened, nodded once, and moved on. Later, in the restroom, he stood alone at the sink, hands resting on the porcelain, eyes fixed on his reflection. The face staring back showed no anger, only calculation slowed by something unfamiliar. Doubt. Back at headquarters, an internal audit was announced, proposed by senior members and approved with visible relief. It was described as routine, necessary, transparent. He allowed it. The audit rooms filled with quiet activity. Files were moved, accounts reviewed. People were questioned politely, then again with greater detail. Each process created distance, reinforcing the idea that the center no longer held absolute clarity. The boss remained present but removed. He attended briefings without interrupting. He asked fewer questions than expected. In the house, the maid noticed the change in his hours. He returned earlier some nights, later on others. Meals were sometimes untouched, sometimes requested and eaten in silence. One evening, as he passed through the corridor, she paused to let him by. He stopped unexpectedly, not looking at her, only at the wall ahead. For a moment it seemed he might speak. Instead, he continued on. She remained where she was until his footsteps faded. The sense of judgment did not arrive as confrontation. It arrived as absence of certainty, as lowered expectations, as permission granted quietly to doubt his control. By the end of the week, the story circulating within the organization had solidified without a single official word. The failed operation was no longer an anomaly, it was a symptom. He knew this, he felt it in the way rooms held their breath when he entered and released it too soon when he left. That night, he stood on the balcony overlooking the city. Lights stretched outward, indifferent and constant. Below, life continued without regard for hierarchy or consequence. Inside, the house was silent. The staff had retired. Only one light remained in the kitchen, where the maid finished wiping the counter, her movements unhurried, exact. The boss remained still, hands resting on the railing, the weight of unspoken judgment pressing down without a visible source. Nothing had been proven, nothing had been denied, and yet everything had already begun to shift. The boss altered his routine without announcement. He stopped arriving first, he stopped leaving last. His presence became irregular, appearing at times that disrupted expectation rather than reinforcing it.
When he did enter a room, he chose seats along the side instead of the center, positioning himself where he could see faces without being framed by them. Meetings continued, but he spoke less. When reports were delivered, he listened with his head slightly lowered, eyes lifted just enough to observe reactions rather than content. He watched how often a man glanced toward another before answering. He noted who spoke with confidence and who padded statements with caution. Small behaviors began to separate themselves. One senior member avoided sitting beside him, choosing a place nearer the door. Another addressed his remarks not to the boss directly, but to the table as a whole. Laughter, when it occurred, broke unevenly, stopping too quickly when his gaze shifted. He did not respond to any of it. During a review of accounts, an assistant hesitated before handing him a folder, then corrected himself with an unnecessary explanation. The boss accepted the file without comment, turning the pages slowly, as if reading required no urgency. The assistant stood longer than required, then excused himself without instruction. In the corridor outside, two men lowered their voices as the boss passed. He did not turn his head. The sound carried anyway, not words, tone. At the end of the week, he canceled a scheduled dinner with external partners. The reason was delivered through his office, brief and formal. No alternative date was proposed. The response arrived quickly, respectful but distant, as though the cancellation confirmed something already suspected. At headquarters, security protocols were adjusted under the guise of efficiency. Entry logs were reviewed more often, access permissions were reorganized. None of it was directed by him, but all of it bore the language of precaution. He allowed it to continue. Instead of issuing directives, he observed the gaps left by inaction. He watched who filled them and how. One afternoon, he remained seated after a meeting had officially ended. Papers were gathered, chairs scraped back. The room emptied in stages, each man offering a nod before leaving. When only one remained, a mid-level coordinator lingered by the door, shifting his weight, waiting for a signal that did not come. The boss did not look up. After a moment, the man left. At home, the rhythm of the house remained consistent. Doors opened and closed at familiar hours. Footsteps moved along the same paths. The maid followed her schedule precisely, beginning before sunrise, finishing after dusk. She cleaned rooms that were already clean. She straightened objects that had not moved. Her work left no visible improvement, only continuity. When the boss returned one evening earlier than expected, she was polishing the banister. She stepped aside without hesitation, lowering her gaze, hands clasped loosely in front of her. He passed within arm's length. She did not look up. In the dining room, he ate alone. The meal was prepared as usual, balanced and orderly. He took several bites, then paused, leaving the rest untouched. The plate was cleared later without comment, the food disposed of carefully, as if waste required discretion. The maid noticed details others missed. She noted when documents were left on a side table instead of the desk. She observed which rooms were locked during the day and which were not. She adjusted her path through the house to avoid interrupting moments of stillness. When voices carried faintly from behind closed doors, she did not slow her steps. The boss spent more time in silence. He stood by windows longer than necessary, not looking outward, but using the reflection to observe movement behind him. He positioned himself where he could see entrances indirectly, measuring timing, posture, hesitation. Once, during a briefing, he asked a question that required no immediate relevance. The room answered too quickly. The response was correct, but the speed unsettled him. He said nothing.
Later that night, he reviewed surveillance footage alone, not for evidence of intrusion, but for patterns of presence: who arrived early, who stayed late, who left together. The footage revealed nothing conclusive, only familiarity rearranged. In the house, the maid replaced a light bulb in the hallway outside his study. The fixture flickered briefly before settling into steady brightness. She tested it twice, then wiped the glass clean, removing fingerprints that had accumulated over time. Inside the study, the boss paused mid-page as the light stabilized. He did not turn around. Days passed with the same quiet pressure. The organization continued to function. Money moved, orders were executed, but the center felt less fixed, as though authority had become an object under consideration rather than an assumption. The boss stood apart from it, neither reinforcing nor resisting. His silence created space, and into that space others stepped carefully, measuring ground that had once been solid. One evening, as the house settled into night, the boss remained seated in the living room, lights dimmed, television off. The maid finished her final task in the kitchen, rinsing her hands at the sink. She paused before turning off the light. In the reflection of the darkened window, she saw the boss seated behind her, motionless, watching not the room, but the way it held together in stillness. She turned off the light and walked away without sound. He did not move. The silence that followed felt deliberate, as if something unseen was being weighed, not yet decided, but no longer ignored.
The first removal was framed as procedure. A mid-level operations manager was asked to take leave pending review. The request arrived through formal channels, accompanied by a list of irregularities that appeared precise but lacked weight. Access cards were collected. His office was cleared within an hour. The chair was reassigned before the day ended. No announcement followed. The absence spoke on its own. The boss did not intervene. He read the report twice, then placed it face down on his desk. When asked whether further action was required, he nodded once, neither approving nor resisting. The process moved forward without his voice attached to it. Others took note. A second subordinate was reassigned to a peripheral role. His work history suggested loyalty built over years, not months. Still, a pattern was identified, lines drawn between timing and proximity, behavior interpreted as potential alignment with the failed operation. The evidence relied on correlation, not intent. The reassignment came with a polite explanation and a firm deadline. He packed his belongings carefully. Several men watched without offering assistance. When he passed the boss in the corridor, he paused, expecting acknowledgement. The boss did not look up from the document in his hands. The man bowed anyway and left. Suspicion began to feel productive. It gave movement to uncertainty. Committees were formed. Reviews extended beyond their original scope. Meetings multiplied, each one narrowing focus on individuals who had once operated without question. The language shifted subtly. Words like trust and alignment appeared more frequently, always accompanied by qualifiers. The boss attended each session with the same controlled posture. His face revealed nothing. He listened to arguments delivered with care, watching how blame was distributed evenly enough to appear fair. When he spoke, it was only to request clarification, never defense. One loyal enforcer was brought in for questioning late one night. He arrived early, dressed properly, hands empty. He answered each inquiry without hesitation, his responses consistent with records already on file. Still, the interview extended beyond its necessary length. When it ended, he was told to wait. Hours passed. No one returned. By morning, his access had been revoked. A temporary suspension was issued, justified by pending concerns.
He stood in the lobby holding a jacket he no longer needed, watching men he had trained avoid his eyes as they passed. The boss remained upstairs. At headquarters, the atmosphere hardened. Conversations became clipped. Jokes disappeared entirely. The sound of footsteps carried differently, heavier as though each movement required awareness of being seen. The boss felt it tightening around him. He began to question his own assessments. Each memory replayed with altered emphasis. Each decision appeared vulnerable when revisited under new light. Trust, once extended with calculation, now seemed like exposure. He did not voice these doubts. He allowed them to settle. At home, the effects arrived indirectly. A new security officer questioned the maid about her access to certain rooms. His tone was neutral, but his posture rigid, blocking the corridor until she answered. She responded simply, providing the same information she had given years earlier. He took notes anyway. Later, a supply delivery was delayed pending verification. The kitchen operated with reduced stock for 2 days. Meals were adjusted quietly, portions recalculated without mention. The boss noticed the change but said nothing. The maid continued her routine without deviation. She cleaned the study after midnight when the boss was away, careful not to disturb the arrangement of papers. She aligned edges, smoothed surfaces, restored order without leaving a signature. When a file was misplaced during a security sweep, she returned it to its original position without comment. Hostility did not announce itself, it accumulated. One morning, a junior accountant was escorted out under supervision. His mistake had been minor, but the response was disproportionate. The message was clear: uncertainty no longer tolerated patience. The boss watched the escort from his office window. He recognized the accountant's walk, the slight stiffness that came from shock rather than guilt. For a moment he considered intervening. He turned away instead. That afternoon, a trusted advisor requested a private meeting. The advisor spoke carefully, outlining concerns about morale, about overcorrection. He did not accuse, he suggested restraint. The boss listened, hands folded, eyes steady. When the advisor finished, the boss thanked him and ended the meeting. No guidance followed. The advisor left with less certainty than he had arrived with. By evening, the advisor's name appeared on a list for further review. At home, the maid encountered the advisor's wife in the driveway the next day, collecting personal items from a vehicle. The woman's movements were restrained, her voice quiet as she spoke to the driver. The maid lowered her gaze and continued walking. Inside, she prepared tea that went untouched. The boss returned later than usual. His coat was damp from rain. He removed it slowly, folding it over a chair instead of handing it off. He stood in the entryway longer than necessary, listening to the house settle around him. The maid passed through the hall carrying clean linens. She adjusted her path to avoid crossing his line of sight. In the days that followed, the line between caution and cruelty blurred. A loyal driver was replaced without explanation. A security detail was rotated abruptly, disrupting established routines. Each change was justified individually, yet together they created a climate where loyalty offered no protection. The boss reviewed updated personnel charts late into the night. Names he had once associated with stability now appeared under review or reassignment. He traced connections with his finger, then withdrew his hand, leaving the pattern incomplete. Sleep came in fragments. During one meeting, a senior member proposed a harsher measure against internal threats. The suggestion was framed as necessity. Several heads nodded. The room waited. The boss paused before responding. He approved a limited version of the proposal, stripped of its most severe elements. Even so, the approval marked a shift. The room accepted it as confirmation. Later, alone, he stood at the sink in a private restroom, water spilling over his hands, cold and steady, then turned it off without drying them. At home, the maid noticed a new lock installed on a door that had never required one. She adjusted her schedule to accommodate the change, memorizing new boundaries without protest. One evening, as she cleared the dining table, a security officer questioned her again, this time about timing, when she finished her tasks, where she went afterwards, whether she had seen anyone unfamiliar. She answered each question plainly. The officer dismissed her with a nod that carried no apology. The boss observed the exchange from the far end of the room, his expression unreadable. He did not intervene, he did not signal. The maid collected the last glass, wiped the table clean, and left the room without looking back. That night, another subordinate was removed. This one did not receive formal notice. His phone stopped working, his access disappeared. He was told to wait for instructions that never came. The boss received the update in silence. He stood by the window afterward, city lights reflecting faintly across the glass. Below, traffic moved without awareness of internal fracture. Behind him, the house remained quiet. The maid finished her work, turned off the lights, and paused briefly at the threshold, as if listening for something that did not arrive. The boss did not call out. In the space left by loyalty stripped away, suspicions settled deeper, no longer searching for truth, only confirmation. Nothing had been resolved. Only the cost had increased.
The first inconsistency appeared without announcement. During a routine financial reconciliation, a junior analyst flagged a timing discrepancy. A transfer associated with the failed operation had cleared earlier than recorded, its authorization timestamp misaligned by several hours. The analyst hesitated before submitting the note, attaching it to a larger report so it would not stand alone. The boss noticed it immediately. He did not react. He read the report to the end, closed the folder, and placed it aside. Later that evening, he retrieved older records from a locked cabinet, comparing dates, scanning margins, studying handwriting rather than figures. The discrepancy repeated itself in a different form, small enough to be overlooked, precise enough to matter. He marked nothing. At headquarters, the reviews continued, but their momentum shifted. Accusations that had once moved freely now encountered resistance, not from him, but from the facts themselves. A log that should have confirmed presence showed absence instead. A security camera angle failed to align with a previously accepted account. Each inconsistency was minor. Together, they unsettled the foundation of the narrative that had justified removal and punishment. The boss requested raw data instead of summaries. The request was received without comment, but the delay in response was noticeable. When the data arrived, it came in fragments, unassembled, requiring patience to reconstruct. He worked alone. Late at night, he replayed audio logs with the sound low, listening not for content but for rhythm, pauses where there should have been overlap, interruptions that arrived too cleanly. He noticed how often certain names appeared adjacent to authority, how rarely they appeared under scrutiny. At home, the maid adjusted her routine again. A security sweep had left several drawers open in the study. Files had been handled without order, some returned incorrectly, others not returned at all. She closed the drawers one by one, checking contents against memory rather than labels. One envelope did not belong where it had been placed. She removed it without hesitation and carried it to the linen closet, sliding it behind folded towels where it would not be seen. Later, when the house was quiet, she returned it to its proper location, aligning it precisely with the others, erasing the trace of displacement. No one noticed the correction. The boss began to feel the weight of contradiction pressing against his earlier certainty. He reviewed the timeline of the operation again, this time removing assumptions he had accepted under pressure. Without those assumptions, the sequence changed shape. A man he had suspected could not have been present when required. Another had access denied at a critical moment, despite claims to the contrary. The pattern of the trail no longer pointed inward but upward, toward layers that had remained untouched. He closed the file and sat still, hands resting flat on the desk.
At headquarters, a senior member argued forcefully for expanding internal measures, citing instability. The argument relied on conclusions rather than evidence. The boss listened, his expression neutral, then asked for documentation supporting a specific claim. The documentation did not arrive. The meeting ended earlier than planned. Several attendees avoided eye contact as they left. One paused as if to speak, then reconsidered. The boss remained seated, reviewing notes that now read differently than before. At home, the maid overheard fragments of conversation during a late-night call. She was passing the study with a tray when a voice rose briefly, then fell into careful restraint. She did not slow her steps. She did not look toward the door. Later, she returned to collect the empty tray and noticed a document partially protruding from a folder on the desk. The edge bore a handwritten mark, faint but distinctive. She adjusted it inward, closing the folder completely. Her hand lingered for a moment longer than necessary. The boss began cross-checking personnel changes against access logs, a task he had previously delegated. The overlap was subtle but consistent. Those who had benefited most from the removals had also gained expanded reach during the same period. He summoned one of them for a brief update. The conversation was polite, efficient. The man spoke confidently, offering reassurance rather than detail. When asked a follow-up question, he answered too quickly, then corrected himself. The boss thanked him and dismissed him. When the door closed, the boss did not return to his desk. He stood instead, facing the wall, breathing evenly, allowing the implications to settle without forcing conclusion. In the house, a minor power outage occurred just after midnight. Backup lighting activated in stages. The maid moved through the corridors, checking switches, ensuring doors remained secured. In the study, the computer screen remained dark. She unplugged the device before power fully returned, then reconnected it once the system stabilized. The action was simple, deliberate, leaving no indication of intervention. By morning, the system logs showed no interruption. The boss noticed. Not immediately, but later when reviewing system health reports that showed continuity where a gap should have existed. He frowned slightly, not in suspicion but in recognition. Something was being preserved. At headquarters, a previously removed subordinate submitted an appeal through unofficial channels. The appeal contained no argument, only timestamps and access records. The boss read it twice, then placed it atop the growing stack of contradictions. He did not reinstate the subordinate. Yet. At home that evening, the maid prepared a meal that the boss had not requested in months. It was prepared correctly, without flourish. He noticed it, hesitated, then ate a small portion. Nothing was said. Later, as she cleared the table, she found a folded note beneath the placemat, likely dropped earlier. She did not open it. She placed it on the sideboard where it would be found. The boss retrieved it the next morning. The note contained a single reference point, incomplete but precise. It aligned with the emerging pattern. He looked toward the kitchen doorway, empty and clean. For the first time in days, his expression shifted, not toward certainty but toward direction. That night, as the house settled into its familiar quiet, the maid turned off the last light and paused, listening to the steady hum of electricity restored and uninterrupted. Upstairs, the boss remained awake, staring at a sequence that no longer accused the wrong people. The truth had not revealed itself, but it had stopped hiding in the same place.
The shift did not begin with confrontation. It began with alignment. The boss ordered a restricted internal review, limited in scope and personnel. The selection appeared random, but it was not. Each person chosen had either remained untouched by prior purges or had quietly lost influence during them. No explanation accompanied the order. Compliance followed without enthusiasm. Files were requested directly, not summaries, originals. As documents moved from office to office, patterns surfaced with increasing clarity. Approvals clustered around the same small group, overrides repeated with identical authorization paths. Decisions that had seemed independent now revealed a shared origin, layered beneath procedural language. The betrayal had not been scattered, it had been managed. The boss reviewed the material in silence, page after page, his pace unhurried. When he reached the final document, he did not close it. He left it open on the desk, as if its presence no longer required concealment. He called a meeting for the following evening. The invitations were selective. Senior figures, those who had spoken most forcefully during the period of suspicion, those whose confidence had grown as others fell. The meeting location was familiar, chosen for neutrality rather than authority. When they arrived, the atmosphere was controlled but tense. Seats were taken deliberately. No one spoke beyond greetings. The boss entered last and remained standing until all attention settled. He did not accuse. He asked for clarification on a specific decision made weeks earlier, one that had justified the first removal. The answer came smoothly, supported by references already memorized. He listened, then requested the original authorization log. A pause followed. The log was produced, but it differed slightly from the version previously submitted. The discrepancy was minor. The boss acknowledged it with a nod and asked for the secondary confirmation. This time, the pause lengthened. One man shifted in his seat. Another glanced sideways, then returned his gaze forward. The room grew still in a way that could not be mistaken for respect. The boss placed the documents side by side on the table, aligning their edges carefully. He said nothing. He did not need to. The manipulation revealed itself through absence. Missing signatures, reassigned access, time-stamped approvals that no longer aligned with physical presence. The narrative that had driven weeks of internal damage collapsed under its own precision. The men who had benefited most sat quietly now, their earlier certainty replaced by calculation. The boss thanked them for their time and ended the meeting. No immediate consequences followed. No orders were issued. The lack of response unsettled them more than punishment would have. At headquarters, authority shifted without announcement. Access privileges were adjusted overnight. Committees were dissolved quietly. Decisions once routed through a narrow channel now required broader confirmation. Those who had orchestrated the betrayal found themselves excluded from rooms they had once controlled. The boss watched the transition without satisfaction. At home, the maid continued her routine as before. She prepared meals at the same hours, she cleaned the same rooms, she avoided the same spaces when instructed. Nothing in her behavior suggested awareness of the internal reckoning unfolding beyond the house. One evening, the boss returned later than usual. His expression was unchanged, but his movements carried a subtle restraint, as though each step required consideration. He removed his shoes himself and stood briefly in the entryway, listening to the quiet. The maid passed through the corridor carrying folded laundry. She paused to allow him through, her posture unchanged. As he moved past, a folded slip of paper fell from the inner pocket of his coat, landing near her foot. She noticed it immediately. She did not bend down. She waited until he had moved on, then picked it up carefully, holding it by the edge. The paper was marked with names and times, incomplete but familiar. She folded it once and placed it on the side table beside the door to his study. Nothing more. The next morning, the boss found the paper where it had been placed. He stood over it for a long moment, then picked it up and returned it to his pocket. He did not ask how it had arrived there. Later that day, he reinstated one of the first men removed, restoring his access quietly, without ceremony. The reinstatement did not reach everyone at once. It traveled slowly, carried through observation rather than announcement. At headquarters, those responsible for the manipulation attempted to reassert control through caution. They spoke less. They waited for direction that did not come. Their authority diminished not through force, but through irrelevance. The boss addressed them individually over the following days. The meetings were brief, polite, final. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand explanation. He informed them of changes already made, roles already reassigned. Each man left with the understanding that resistance would serve no purpose. The betrayal had failed not because it was exposed publicly, but because it no longer shaped reality.
At home, the maid adjusted the placement of a framed photograph in the study, straightening it after a late-night cleaning. The photograph showed the boss with several men who were no longer in his inner circle. She aligned it carefully, then moved it to a less prominent shelf. The boss noticed the change days later. He stood before the shelf studying the photograph in its new position. He did not move it back. That evening, he requested tea after dinner, a rare deviation from routine. The maid prepared it and placed the cup on the table without comment. He drank it slowly, watching the steam dissipate. When he finished, he left the cup where it was. She cleared it later, rinsing it thoroughly, drying it with care. The boss sat alone afterward, reviewing a list of names he had trusted and those he had doubted. The imbalance between the two was no longer abstract, it carried weight. He closed the list and set it aside. In the quiet that followed, he understood the cost of his restraint and the depth of his error. Authority had not protected him from misjudgment. Silence had not guaranteed clarity. Loyalty had. Downstairs, the maid turned off the last light and paused briefly, her hand resting on the switch. She listened, not for instruction, but for balance restored. Upstairs, the boss remained seated in the dark, aware that power had returned to his grasp, but not unaware of what it had taken to lose it. The reckoning was complete. The consequences were not.
Order returned without ceremony. There were no announcements, no declarations meant to reassure. Changes occurred through quiet adjustment. Offices reassigned, access restored selectively, procedures simplified, then enforced with consistency rather than suspicion. The organization resumed its rhythm, altered but stable. Those who had been removed unjustly did not all return. Some declined when approached, others had already moved beyond reach. Their absence was acknowledged only through empty desks and outdated contact lists. The boss accepted this without resistance. He spent several mornings reviewing personnel records alone, making corrections where possible, leaving others untouched. When a reinstated subordinate offered thanks, the boss responded with a nod and ended the meeting early. Gratitude felt misdirected. At headquarters, the tone shifted from fear to caution. Men spoke with measured clarity. Decisions followed process rather than instinct. Authority no longer relied on pressure alone. The boss observed it all from a distance he had chosen. At home, the house remained unchanged. The maid continued her routine. She arrived before dawn. She prepared meals on schedule. She cleaned rooms that would not be noticed unless neglected. Her presence remained steady, without claim or expectation. One afternoon, the boss returned earlier than usual. He found her adjusting the curtains in the living room, ensuring they hung evenly. She stepped aside as he entered, lowering her gaze. He stopped. For a moment, the space between them held something unspoken. He looked at her hands, worn but precise, then at the floor she had just cleaned. He inclined his head slightly. She did not respond. She waited until he passed, then resumed her work. No words followed. Later that evening, he opened a locked drawer in his study and removed a modest sum of cash, prepared without notation. He placed the envelope inside a book and returned it to the drawer. The drawer remained closed. Days passed. At headquarters, final adjustments were made. The men responsible for the betrayal were reassigned away from operational authority. Their titles remained, their influence did not. The resolution avoided spectacle. It left no openings for grievance. The boss did not attend their departures. He spent his time restructuring oversight, dividing responsibility so that no single voice carried unchecked reach again. The work was deliberate, slow, and often tedious. He insisted on reviewing steps others considered unnecessary. The cost of mistrust remained visible. At home, the maid prepared a meal that included a dish she had learned he favored years earlier. It was placed on the table without comment. He ate in silence, finishing more than usual. When she cleared the table, she paused briefly, then removed the plate without looking at him. Later, she found a small item left on the counter, a watch, old but well maintained. It had not been placed there by mistake. She lifted it carefully, examined the clasp, and set it back where it was found. The boss noticed it still there the next morning. He did not move it. The days that followed carried a new weight. Decisions were made with greater awareness of consequence. Each choice reflected not only outcome, but memory. The boss walked the corridors of headquarters with less urgency. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his words carried restraint rather than command. At home, the maid continued unnoticed. One evening, as she finished her work, a junior staff member asked her how long she had been with the house. The question was casual, the tone neutral. She answered simply and continued on. No further questions followed. The boss spent a long night alone in his study, reviewing a final report on the operation that had begun the unraveling. The report contained corrections, acknowledgments, and measured conclusions. He signed it and placed it in the archive. The matter was closed. Yet, as he stood by the window afterward, he did not feel resolution. The city below moved without pause. Lights changed, people crossed streets unaware of internal reckonings completed above them. Life continued, indifferent to correction. Downstairs, the maid turned off the last light and paused, as she often did, listening to the quiet settle into place. She adjusted her apron, then walked toward the staff quarters without sound. The boss remained at the window, his reflection faint against the glass. The watch remained on the counter. The envelope remained sealed. Some debts, he understood, were not meant to be paid publicly. They were meant to be carried.